even though you've had to contend with some enemies, God said, I got your back. Shake somebody by the hand and tell them, God got your back on this one. So we're living in some eventful days. What we must understand is the Septuagint translates, or the translators of the Septuagint have translated the Old Testament into Greek and call this book of Chronicles the things that have been omitted, indicating that they regarded it as a supplement to Samuel and the book of Kings. The chronicler wrote to a restored community of Israel after they had come out of exile. Isn't that just like the devil? When you come to a place of restoration and you get a good footing, the enemy gets upset and tries to find a loophole somewhere in your freedom or restored place. Isn't it true that seemingly when we get over one thing, something else is coming at us? Isn't it true that look like when we get free from one situation, the enemy comes to trip us up again? It is his job to strategize against the plan of God. But I came tonight to let somebody know that there is power in your praise. My God, that if you can just get beyond the mechanics of your praise, if we can get beyond from what we've been taught in church as to how to praise, because there are dimensions of praise. There is a praise now that must go forth in the earth. That's a war cry praise. Oh God, help me here. Because the body of Christ is in so much turmoil, and it includes all of us, because there's spiritual warfare that has been waged against our faith, our future, and our promise. It's time now that the war really be on. Tell somebody you ain't seen a fight yet. We're getting ready to put it down, and we're not going to use our fist, and we're not going to use guns and knives, for the Bible have taught us that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but they are mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds and casting down vain imaginations. You ought to just shake somebody and say the fight is on. Yeah, you ain't got to fight this one. God got it. God got it. All he wants you to do is just stand still and let him do what only a God can do. And so I'm rushing on to my text. Here we have a coalition of demons. Demons that have come out with all of their forces, collaborating to confront who you are and to threaten your security of your faith. I need to say that again. There's a coalition of demonic forces that have been assigned in this season to confront who you are and to threaten the security of your faith, to threaten the security of your family, and to threaten the security of your finances and your future. I just want somebody to know that the God I serve, he is still able. My God, that the God I serve, he can do anything. It matters not the threat of the enemy. God is on our side. If God before us, who can stand against us? I want you to know that in the midst of this text that we have, the backdrop of the text is that Jehoshaphat had made a decision that he was no longer going to be in alliance with those who did not believe in his God. And so he made a decision that I'm going to make God of Israel my choice. He was the successor of King Asa, and King Asa was a godly man. So Jehoshaphat had to get himself together. Shake your neighbor on the shoulder and say, we got to get ourselves together. If we're ever going to get to the place that God has destined for our lives, we got to lay aside some stuff now. It's enough got the enemy on your back than to have your own stuff in the way. And so Jehoshaphat made a decision that I'm going to serve the God of Israel. And when he made that decision, looked like all of hell broke loose. Can I tell somebody tonight that when you make up your mind that for God I'll live and for God I'll die, the devil will start bringing up your past. He'll start bringing up your failures. He'll start bringing up the last mistake. And he will tell you, you ain't gonna ever be nothing. I want somebody to beg to differ with the devil and say, yeah, I got a pass. And you got a pass. All God's children got a pass. But the truth of the matter is, the hand of the Lord is still on me, because God can trust me even though I made some bad mistakes and some wrong choices. I hung out with the wrong group of people, but now I made a decision. I'm in here for the long haul. Slap your neighbor 5 and say, I'm here to stay. I'm here to stay. Can nothing pluck me out. That's the reason why I say to you tonight, don't you let nobody define you by your behavior. All of us have acted like monkeys without a banana at some time or another. All of us have acted a little crazy and out of our mind one time or another. But don't count me out just because I was trying to get myself together. I was trying to go through the test. I was trying to go through the encounter. I had a little monkey on my back, but that's not who I really am. I am what God says I am. I be it now and I be nothing else. Somebody clap your hands and bless him. And so we have here the enemy now is waging war with Jehoshaphat. Now, you ain't seen a fight until you see a family fight. Lord have mercy. You ain't seen a good fight until you get in a good fight with a church. Church fights and family fights, I think they are better than the wrestling matches. Lord have mercy. Pardon my folly. So here we have the Ammonites and the Moabites and those who are of Mount Seir, who were the Mennonites. Now, the Ammonites was a people of hostility. They never did like Jehoshaphat. Sidebar, everybody ain't gonna like you. Lord have mercy. That's the first thing you gotta get over, is that everybody, they ain't gonna like you. I had to learn it the hard way, CoPastor. I bought me some friends when I didn't know any better, taking them out to dinner, driving them in my car, letting them sleep in my apartment, letting them wear my clothes and my shoes, and then walked out and left me when they found a good job. And when I didn't have a job, I couldn't find none of them jokers to even loan me $20 to get me a Happy Meal at McDonald's. Y'all ain't gonna help me up in here tonight. I'm getting ready to go to Dallas, Texas. I think that's where I'm going. But before I get there, I gotta to let somebody know tonight. It matters not if everybody don't like you. You need a few enemies just so that you can at least serve God. You just missed that. You need a few enemies. Tell somebody, I need just a few, just a few. I don't need a whole lot of them, but I need just a few. Just in case if I forget about where God brought me from, I got an enemy just to remind me. So.
ABC News. With David Brinkley. Now from our Washington headquarters, here's David Brinkley.
President Reagan has traveled all over like a candidate for sheriff, trying to help elect Republicans to the U.S. Senate, in the hope he will not have to spend his last 2 years in office dealing with a Democratic Senate and House. Well, no one knows now if he succeeded. The polls are so close you can read them either way you like, and the only poll that counts will be on Tuesday, the elections. Well, how will they go? And in either case, what will they mean? We'll ask today's guests. Donald Regan, Chief of Staff in the White House. Senator John Hines, Republican, Pennsylvania, Chairman of the National Republican Senatorial Committee. Senator George Mitchell, Democrat, Maine, Chairman of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. Some background from our man Jack Smith. And our discussion here with George Will, Sam Donaldson, and Jody Powell, all here on our Sunday program. First, the news, and there is some since the Sunday morning papers. One of the Americans held hostage in Lebanon was set free this morning. David Jacobson, who had been held 17 months by the Shiite Muslims, was let go. He was the head of the American University in Beirut, the hospital at the American University. He will be on his way home soon. The Shiites also said in very vague terms that if the United States goes on with the approaches now underway, the whole hostage problem could be solved. Not clear what that means. Larry Speaks in Santa Barbara has more details. The Western White House.
I have a statement by the President. The President is pleased to announce that one of the Americans held hostage in Beirut has been released. David Jacobson was released early this morning by his captors in Beirut. His family has been notified and will be joining him soon. The President wants to express his personal appreciation to the various parties and intermediaries who have been helpful in arranging this release. We have been working through a number of sensitive channels for a long time. However, we cannot divulge any of the details of the release because the lives of other Americans and other Western hostages are still at risk. Again, we call on the captors of all hostages in Lebanon to release their innocent victims. No political goals are or will be achieved by resorting to extortion or terrorism. We will hold the captors of the remaining American hostages in Lebanon responsible for the safety of those Americans. The President's thoughts and prayers go out to the families and to those American hostages as we continue to work for their safe return. Question?
To be released today or in the near future?
Pardon?
Do you expect another American hostage to be released today or tomorrow in the near future?
It is a very difficult situation to assess and to make predictions. We remain hopeful. We remain hard at work through a number of channels on this question, but we cannot make any predictions. Okay, wait.
In other words, you're not going to rule out
here, and I'll go right around.
You're not going to rule out the possibility that there may be other hostages, one or more, released in addition to Jacob.
We remain hopeful, but we cannot say either way.
Larry, Islamic Jihad said that one of the reasons that they released Jacobson was because of new approaches by the U.S. government, and that if those approaches weren't completed, then they might not release any others. What are the new approaches they're talking about? Has there been any change in U.S. policy, any concessions, any negotiations?
There have been no change. There has been no change in U.S. policy. We continue our policy of talking with anyone who can be helpful, but we do not make concessions, nor do we ask third countries to do so. We have not changed our policy at
You know
all.
what they're talking about when they talk about new approaches, though, by the U.S. government that resulted in Jacobson's release?
Just don't have any comment on that.
Larry, you said that
Larry, you say that you don't know, or you won't say what the new approaches are, but you have always said you're willing to talk. Can you now say that there have been talks?
Well, we have consistently explored a number of channels in order to secure the release of the American hostages that were held in Beirut and in parts of Lebanon. And we've talked with a number of people over a long period of time. We've had very intensive discussions with various parties who could be helpful, but we will not be specific as to who they were.
Can you say if there are new channels?
Well, we have had a number of channels for a period of time, so as a general routine, there are new channels.
Can you tell us, I know you don't want to name a lot of people, but Terry Waite's involvement is quite apparent at this point. Does the President's appreciation go to Terry Waite particularly?
Yes, we're appreciative of the efforts that Terry Waite has made over the last year to secure release of not only American hostages, but those of other countries. The United States has provided transportation support to Mr. Waite because of the difficulty and danger in the travel to Beirut, but we will not be able to go into any more details. Norm?
Can you tell us whether the 5 or 6 other Americans still missing in Lebanon are being held by the same group?
There have been, we've seen various reports. We've had various bits of information about how and when they may be held, their period of captivity, and their location, and those responsible has changed from time to time. I don't think it would be appropriate now to talk about specific groups that may be holding certain of our...
Do not know whether the Islamic...
Larry Speaks, the White House press secretary, in Santa Barbara, where President Reagan is spending the weekend. He's been campaigning on the West Coast. We'll be back with Donald Regan, the White House Chief of Staff, and the chairman of the Republican and Democratic senatorial campaign committees, and all the rest of today's program in a moment.
This week with David Brinkley, brought to you by ADM. We bring home America's harvest. And by General Electric. At GE, we bring good things to life.
The eye is sensitive to light. That's why we make the GE Soft White. An ordinary frosted bulb has a hot spot. It doesn't have the high diffusion coating of the GE Soft White, the light that's sensitive to the needs of the human eye.
At GE, everything we do is to help you live your life just the way you want to.
We give you time to live your dreams and style, to let you see the light that lights your life, the light that sees you through. Joy to catch them when they smile, and you know all the while this is the light for you. Time to let you live your life, to let you see the signs. Smile, we stay as true as you. We'll always be GE. We bring good things to life.
It's costing $639 million to elect a new Congress, all of the House and a third of the Senate. That works out to $639,000 per member. The American people will get a new Congress, but they have had very little discussion of what it will do, since most of the campaigning was negative, attacks on opponents, some of them quite nasty. The Democrats will keep the House, but the Senate is in doubt. Here's some background from Jack Smith. Jack?
David, the main issue in this election is whether Democrats can wrest control of the Senate from Republicans. For some, it's the only issue.
And Father, we pray tonight in a special way for those of us who call ourselves Democrats.
Help from above, help from the White House.
You'll be winning one for the giver.
The president this week toured 10 key states.
Really do appreciate your help.
And politicians everywhere made last-minute pitches to voters in what promises to be one of the closest contests in years.
It's going to be right down to the wire. Somebody's going to stagger across the finish line first.
The latest ABC News Washington Post poll Friday showed Democrats gaining either 3 seats which would mean a 50-50 deadlock that the vice president could break, leaving the GOP in control, or gaining 4 seats, which would give the Democrats a bare 51-49 majority. The outcome hinges on some 11 key states clustered in the West and the South. The GOP must win in most, and 5 are crucial. In the West, Idaho. Republican incumbent Senator Stephen Sims accuses his opponent, John Evans, of being too liberal.
John Evans' support comes from, the labor unions, the liberal PACs in the East, and from the environmentalists.
Idaho's conservative, all right, but its farmers are also going bankrupt, and that makes incumbent Sims vulnerable.
Steve Sims has voted for lower wheat price supports 14 different times.
Democrat John Evans has made the state's economy the issue, but as Idaho's governor can't escape some blame himself. He should, however, benefit from the heavy Democratic turnout expected Tuesday to overturn Idaho's right-to-work law. And polls show the Idaho race in a dead heat. North Dakota. Farmers here are suffering too. That's bad news for Republican Senator Mark Andrews, and he's been getting help from the president.
The last thing farmers need is to return to the party that gave them grain embargoes, outrageous inflation, and 21.5% interest rates.
Andrews' opponent, Kent Conrad, North Dakota's Democratic tax commissioner, has run a populist campaign keyed to agricultural discontent.
The question really is, what kind of message do we send Washington?
The race in this conservative state is a dead heat, too. Colorado, Republican Congressman Ken Kramer is one of the few GOP candidates to make an issue of the Iceland summit. He's long been a supporter of the president's Star Wars defense as a means of bringing needed jobs to Colorado.
And that's why we have to send Ken Kramer to the United States Senate.
Kramer's opponent, Democratic Representative Tim Wirth, is being outspent and recently asked his staff to forgo their paychecks to help fund his final TV blitz. Wirth is a generally liberal Democrat, Kramer a conservative Republican, but their differences have been obscured by personal attacks.
You suggest that the positions you've taken are courageous. I would say it's outrageous.
How in the world are the people of Colorado ever going to trust you as a United States Senator, Congressman Wirth?
The ABC Washington Post poll shows Republican Kramer ahead. The South is crucial to GOP hopes for a national political realignment. North Carolina. The president's been here 3 times since June. For Republican Senator James Broyhill is counting on his coattails.
The truth is, the best man for the job is already on the job.
Groping for issues, Broyhill has criticized his Democratic opponent, Terry Sanford, for a tax increase while governor 25 years ago.
I'll never forgive Sanford for the food tax. It hurt a lot of people.
Now look at that ad that had the whiny little Republican woman on it.
Sanford has talked about farms and textile imports, but unemployment's not that high and the state's conservative. Still, polls show Democrat Sanford slightly ahead. Louisiana. With the state's oil industry in shock and unemployment at 12.5%, Republican Congressman Henson Moore had a disadvantage. But he scored early gains from a major corruption scandal last year that divided Louisiana's Democratic Party.
Our people are changing in Louisiana. They're voting for the man, not the party. They're upset with what's going on in the state. They want to break from the past.
Moore's opponent, Democratic Representative John Breaux, though, has come from behind.
The Republicans have tried to kick 40,000 black folks off of the ballot.
Recent court evidence suggested that a well-publicized GOP voter security program here was really targeted at black voters. This has boosted Breaux among Louisiana blacks, and a high turnout's expected. Polls show Democrat Breaux now with a slight lead. The midterm election is ending as it began, with no central theme. The president's been trying to inject one, and with so many tight races, he might make a difference. Republicans have also been outspending Democrats by some estimates 7-1. But in the Senate, Democrats still spell victory.
And the American people will have a check and balance against what has been at times a very arrogant White House that has no monopoly on ideas or monopoly on patriotism. So we're going to see some changes.
The president already faces growing resistance from Congress on issues like trade, South Africa, and the defense budget. That's why both parties now are focused on the Senate, for it holds the key to the remaining 2 years of this administration. David?
Jack, thank you. Coming next, Senator John Hines, Republican, Pennsylvania, chairman of the National Republican Senatorial Committee, and Senator George Mitchell, Democrat of Maine, chairman of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, and shortly, Donald Regan, Chief of Staff in the White House. In a moment. Senator Hines and Senator Mitchell, thank you both very much for coming in today. Senator Hines here in Washington and Senator Mitchell in Boston. Thank you for coming. Here in the studio are George Will of ABC News and Sam Donaldson, ABC News White House correspondent. Now, for the two senators, let's get this out of the way first. We have polls and predictions without number. They are conflicting. Everyone can read them and interpret them as he sees fit, and I assume both of you have done this with great care. So tell me what your conclusion is. Senator Hines?
David, there are a lot of close races, but I think that when all the votes are counted, that we Republicans will continue to control the Senate, but there's a caveat, and that is those western states in the Rocky Mountains and on the coast, Colorado, California, Washington, Idaho. I hope that they're not going to be influenced by any predictions such as those I saw that the ABC might make before the polls close. I hope you won't do that, and I think if people are allowed to vote, I think we'll get a fair count, and the chips will fall where they may. I think it'll be a Republican day, though.
I believe ABC has said it will not call any results until the polls are closed. But I don't make policy here. Senator Mitchell?
I think there'll be 53 Democrats and 47 Republicans when the new Congress convenes in January.
All right.
I'd like to ask each of you, beginning with you, Senator Mitchell, to comment on this. There's a general feeling among those of us who've watched these campaigns closely that they're kind of disgusting. That is, the negative tone is simply higher than ever before. Can you tell us, if you agree with that assessment, and B, why that's so?
Well, there have been more negative campaigns, and they are more negative than in the past. That's clear. I don't know the reason for it other than it seems as though it works. It began really in modern times, that is the last decade. In 78 and 1980, negative campaigns were run with great success against several incumbent Democratic senators. And the number of campaigns which have gone negative and the intensity of the negativism seems to have increased. I hope very much that in this year, some of those who've waged the most negative campaigns will not win, because that, I think, will be the only deterrent to such activity in the future.
Senator Hines?
There have been more negative campaigns, George. In part, I think it's because the Democrats are afraid to attack President Reagan. He's very popular. In part, the economy has been good, 48 straight months, and as a result, I think a lot of the Democratic challengers, and that's two-thirds of the people, of course, running for the Senate, have had to go on the attack on people's character. I think there's evidence that that's beginning to backfire in a number of states, but it certainly has been an extremely negative year. I hope we don't see this kind of campaigning in the future.
We've been told from both sides, but particularly from the Republican side, Senator Hines, that the fate of Western civilization as we know it depends on the Republicans holding the Senate. Suppose there are 51 Democrats in the Senate next week. Tell us how that will change life in America.
Well, I think there would be some changes, the most significant of which is that the president, who relied on the Senate these last 6 years to give life to his legislative initiatives, particularly the ones that got the economy moving again and which brought about the low interest rates, the 2% or so inflation rate that we have, the president wouldn't have the Senate as a legislative initiator in his behalf, and I think that would hurt him a good deal.
Senator Mitchell, let me turn that question around a little bit. We are told that the two main issues, if there are issues today that are on people's mind, are drugs, and we have a drug bill now, and the deficit. And, of course, the deficit hasn't been cured. If the Democrats should take back the Senate, what will the Democrats do to cure the deficit that has not been done?
Well, we certainly, I think, will provide a more balanced approach to the problem, and I think will produce significant reductions in the deficit beyond which have occurred in recent years.
How?
By having a balanced approach, that is, to have a restraint in domestic spending and restraint in defense spending. The administration's approach has really been to increase spending by the national government, but merely to shift it from one area to the other. I'd like, if I might, just make one brief comment on the negative comment that Senator Hines made. The fact is that it's Republican candidates who really created this art form in Senate races in the last decade and have carried it to a new high level. The overwhelming majority of negative conduct has been by Republican candidates. Now, I don't suggest Democrats are blameless. No party has a monopoly on good and rightness. But I think his comment really misstates the circumstances that exist in this case.
I don't know if I'm allowed to get into debate here, but I have a comment.
Go right ahead, Senator, and then I'm going to come back to this balanced approach.
All right. Well, I hesitate to interrupt you on that, but...
Please, you're the guest.
The fact is that in campaign after campaign, Democrats have been attacking and going negative because they don't have a theme, they don't have an approach to balancing the budget, and they're trying to avoid having to face up to the kinds of policies they once advocated. In fact, as we're seated here right now, in 7 states where Democrats have close races against Republican incumbent senators, the Democrats are throwing out the Social Security red herring, trying to frighten senior citizens. In fact, the facts are that inflation has been up 27% since 1980. The average Social Security benefit has increased 40%, well above the inflation rate, and yet Democrats in Alabama, Mr. Shelby, who's trying to unseat Senator Denton, is attacking him right now as we're here.
Senator Mitchell, will you answer that? And then I'm going to come back to a further question for you on balanced approach.
Sure. Senator Denton has voted several times to reduce Social Security cost of living benefits. That's a legitimate statement for his opponent to make. It's one thing to describe a campaign as negative, but when a candidate points to a specific vote and a series of votes that someone's made, I don't think that's negative. I think what the kind of negative campaign that people deplore are the kind that Republican candidates are running in Wisconsin and California, which distort the record, which focus on things that are not related to votes, and which really create bogus issues.
All right, Senator Mitchell, when you say balanced approach, are you suggesting we may in fact have to have some sort of tax increase sometime, someplace in this country in order to balance the budget?
I think the Democratic leadership has made it clear that there will not be a tax increase unless and until President Reagan asks for one. Now, the fact is, of course, that while the president says he's against tax increases, over the past 5 years he has supported, endorsed, and signed into law increases in every federal tax other than the income tax. The president is against raising the income tax, but he's for increasing every other federal tax. That's happened during his term. I think it's likely to happen in the near future. The president's fiscal year 1987 budget proposed 10 specific increases in taxes. They were called other things. If that occurs, it will only be at the president's request with the president's consent.
Gentlemen, one of the reasons the campaigns this year have been so omnipresent and so noisy, some people say, is that the candidates have more money than is good for them or us or the nation. And indeed, some people think life in the Senate is being spoiled by the amount of time all of you spend as incumbents raising funds for 6 years to spend in that 6th year. Do you think there is, after this year's experience, going to be a move toward some kind of public financing of these campaigns? Go ahead, Mr. Mitchell.
Well, I've introduced public financing legislation in every session of the Congress that I've been in. I think, frankly, the current system, to be blunt, stinks. There's much too much money in it. The only reason keeping this a close election is the overwhelming financial advantage the Republicans have. And everything you said in your question is true. We should apply the presidential system, which is matching funds, private and public contributions, to the Senate races. If it's good enough for the president, and President Reagan has voluntarily participated in this system twice, it ought to be good enough for the elected senators.
Senator Hines, given that the Republicans do seem to have an advantage in private fundraising, do you think that means the party itself will be disposed against public financing, and should be?
No, but I think there are other reasons to have really grave reservations about public financing. I think it's true that the public financing checkoff we have for presidential races has worked well. But if you extend it to House and Senate candidates, you are talking about a level of 10, 15, 20 times the amount of money. I don't think that the taxpayers are willing to step forward with $1 billion in this time of very large budget deficits. What I do think is that we have seen very expensive races, in part because Republicans not only have to run on their record, which is a good record. I find it difficult to believe that people want to fire them because they've done a good job. Sure. And more importantly, they've had to spend more money defending against the attacks that George Mitchell says never take place.
Senator Hines and Senator Mitchell, thank you. Thank you both very much for coming in today. It's been a pleasure to have you with us. Coming next, Donald Regan, Chief of Staff in the White House. In a moment. Mr. Regan, thanks for coming in today.
Nice to be here.
Pleased to have you with us. Before we get into the politics, can you enlarge a bit on what we heard from Larry Speaks, who was in Santa Barbara a few minutes ago?
Well, all we can say at this point is that we do know that Mr. Jacobson is out. He is in our embassy with Terry Waite. He will be transferred to Wiesbaden and given a thorough checkup, although we understand initially his health is pretty good. But because we are still negotiating for the other hostages, we're not going to say anything more about what process we went through to get Mr. Jacobson out or what has happened in the meantime.
Well, the Shiites said the United States was involved in, I'm using their language, approaches which, if continued, could lead to a solution of what they call a hostage crisis, a hostage problem. What do they mean by that?
Well, again, that would reveal much about the negotiations that have been going on over the past several months, and I prefer not to talk about it until we get all of the hostages out. Then we can talk about it.
This break in the crisis comes shortly after Syria got a big black eye in the British courtroom, and they've been much in the news in a way they'd rather not be. And this leads some people to suspect that they could have delivered these hostages anytime they want, and they're doling them out now to improve their international standing. Is that a fair inference?
No, I wouldn't think so, George, although I won't specifically comment on who was involved as intermediaries. The role that Syria has played has been a minimal one.
Mrs. Thatcher, of course, was very helpful to us during the Libyan raid, allowing American planes to operate from bases in her country, and took a lot of criticism for that. And some people think that as a sign of solidarity, we should have been proportional in our response. That is, we should have not just withdrawn our ambassador, but should have broken relations. Is one reason that we didn't the fact that we thought we could, by taking a softer stand against Syria, make the kind of progress that's now been made?
Oh, no. No, we still will condemn Syria as a source of terrorism, and we will take appropriate steps as needed in the future. We thought that our withdrawing the ambassador was a choice between a slap on the wrist and a real stiff penalty toward them. We indicated our displeasure this way, and other steps can be taken if necessary.
Well, the Secretary of State suggested on Friday that, in fact, you will take other steps. Is that correct, or are you simply still assessing the situation?
Well, we can take other steps, and will, if they continue, to adopt these positions of terrorism.
All right, you say you can't talk about the process of negotiation for additional hostages. I understand that, but I want to ask you about the policy. Our policy has been firmly one of not ever giving up something in the way of a demand for someone who's being detained. And is that still the policy?
Yes, that's still our policy.
Well, what about the French? Are we in part of a deal with them whereby they release the man they're holding in jail?
No, the French are not part of this deal at all. That's as far as I'll go on that one, except to say that from our point of view, we hope that in our negotiations we can be helpful to any other country's hostages that are there.
Sam, can I just, in light of what Sam's asked, in what sense is negotiation the right word? If we have nothing to give, and if we're not having a quid pro quo, what are we negotiating about?
Again, I won't talk about that, George, but there's an awful lot goes on in the Middle East, and where there's talk and more talk and a lot of talk, and you keep talking, keep working, and that's what we've been doing quietly, and I think we're showing that our quiet diplomacy is effective.
Why now?
Why now?
Yes.
This is just the time that they finally decided to release it.
Mr. Regan, if I may, it's like the Danilov-Zakharov affair. You all claimed there wasn't a deal, there wasn't a direct
and there
swap.
wasn't.
A lot of people saw it differently. When the record is finally revealed of what's been going on with Jacobson, and we hope some others, but a lot of people still say, well, they may say there's no deal, but there it is.
I don't know what people will say in the future, Sam. I mean, that would be silly of me to try to say in advance until we can spread
everything on the record. But are we meeting demands? That's what I'm suggesting.
Pardon?
Are we meeting demands?
No, we're not meeting demands. Absolutely not.
Well, we say, change the subject slightly. We say Syria supports terrorism. We said Libya supported terrorism. We bombed Libya. And in Syria, we called our ambassador home for consultations. Why such a vast difference in our response?
Well, if you go back in the history of our relationships with Libya, first we warned them, then we warned them again, then we took some of our people out, finally we took our ambassador home. This was progressive. And in the case of Syria, we've warned them again and again, and now we've taken our ambassador out.
That suggests so the next time is the fire.
Well, I don't say it will be, but it could be.
Mr. Reagan, may I just quickly change the subject? Let me hear your version of what President Reagan tentatively agreed to concerning the end of a 10-year phase-out of something with Gorbachev at Reykjavik.
Well, let's make it clear, Sam. President Reagan put something on the table in writing on the Sunday afternoon in Reykjavik. And it was that in the first 5 years, we would agree to a 50% reduction in all strategic nuclear weapons. We agreed further that in the following 5 years that we should bring down in a proportional stages all of our offensive ballistic missiles. When he put that on the table, the General Secretary, and I'm shortening an awful lot of conversation here for a couple of minutes, said to him, why don't you put everything on the table? Why do you just refer to offensive strategic missiles? And the President said, well, what is your definition of what do you want to talk about? He said, I want to talk about all nuclear weapons. The President said, all right, if that's what you want to talk about, let's talk about it. But at that point, nothing happened. The conversation got diverted, and they went on to SDI and whether or not SDI could be tested. And as you know, then the meeting broke up.
Well, as you know, Mr. Beschmiertnik in Moscow has released what he says is a verbatim of President Reagan's words in which he said, the President said, if we can agree on all nuclear weapons, then we can tell our people in Geneva they can come to an agreement which you can sign in Washington. What was he talking about?
Well, exactly that. But there was never any agreement. Long range, the Reagan belief has always been that this should be a world without nuclear weapons.
Well, if I may just press you on that, on Friday, on the campaign trail, the President said quite clearly that when he was talking about him and Gorbachev and SDI, at the end of that period, we would eliminate all nuclear weapons. That's the Soviet position. Why did he say that?
Well, I can't tell you why he said that specifically on that date, but this is his long-range goal. But in the next 10 years, we don't see it, and probably wouldn't see it for a couple of decades, but longer range nuclear weapons elimination is the goal of President Reagan.
Let me interrupt here. We'll be back with more questions for Mr. Reagan in a moment. George, before we get into the politics, you had another question, I believe, about...
Well, about what happened in Iceland, Mr. Reagan, in the sense that there was a kind of reckless improvisation, some people think, going on there. You're saying a world without nuclear weapons is way in the future, so that was a sort of debating point. Getting rid of ballistic missiles by 1996 was very specific. Had anyone taken a hand calculator and figured out how much it would cost to build air defenses to match Soviet air defenses if we're going to rely solely on bombers and cruise missiles? And how you're going to get the American people to spend all that money? They're much more expensive than ballistic missiles in a period that would be hailed as détente because we're getting rid of ballistic missiles.
Well, we've long known that that was our position, to try to get rid of ballistic missiles as quickly as possible.
Is that as quickly as possible? So if they said, well, let's get rid of them in 5 years?
Well, obviously, I doubt if they could write a treaty within a matter of 12 or 18 months to even start and get into the specifics of this.
But you're confident that enough thought had been given to a world in which all we have as a deterrent, assured destruction in the Soviet Union, are cruise missiles and bombers?
We have, under that provision, we would still have some nuclear weapons. We'd have the Honest Johns.
We're talking about how to deliver them.
And, yes, as far as the delivery is concerned. Now, from that point of view, a 10-year period could be achieved. Yes, the Joint Chiefs have said that they are prepared to go along with all ballistic missiles in 10 years.
Could I just follow up with one quick question? As I understand it, administration policy is that sometime during this fiscal quarter, or this quarter, the 131st B-52 will be armed with cruise missiles, which, if nothing else is done, would take us over those old SALT II limits. My question is, have you made a decision on whether you will offset that by taking out some other system?
There's been no decision, except that, of course, that will be deployed, that particular unit. As far as adherence to the SALT II treaty, we have said very carefully that that's a non-existent treaty that is not binding on us in any shape or fashion.
But you are telling me you haven't decided whether to retire for whatever other reasons, perhaps a submarine or some other missile.
That is still under discussion, yes.
Now, Mr. Reagan, the President has been out on the road speechifying in, what, 11 states, I think. And, of course, he wants a Republican Senate, keep a Republican Senate. A number of presidents lately have dealt with Congresses that were held both houses by the opposition party, and without any disastrous results. Suppose the Democrats won the Senate. What would the Reagan administration do?
Well, first of all, let me set the stage
for that.
What would change? Since his return from the ranch Labor Day, this president has traveled 25,000 miles for candidates, unheard of in the history of the presidency. He wants to have a Republican Senate. He wants to hold a House, minimal. I think we will make history, by the way, political history, because the average loss in the Senate is 7 seats. I don't think we're going to do anything near that. And I would say that in the House, where it's normally 48 seats, even at best, the Democrats are saying 10. Now, what the president wants to do is to carry out, obviously, his policies over the next 2 years. That includes getting a handle on this budget deficit and bringing that down. It includes building up a defense and keeping the defense strong so we can negotiate with the Soviets toward disarmament. And obviously wants to keep the economy going. He thinks he'd be better off having a Republican Senate and a decent representation of Republicans in the House.
Haven't you?
Now, if he can't, obviously we'll have to work with him. But it's much better for the president's programs to work with our own party rather than the other.
Haven't you given a hostage to fortune when the president goes into all these states and says, don't think of voting for that Senate candidate, think you're voting for the old Gipper? Now, if they don't vote for the old Gipper, have we had a referendum that the president has lost?
Well, the last time we had a referendum on the president was 1984, and we won in 49 states.
But his name was on the ballot.
But in this one, I'm not sure of the transferability of the great admiration, respect, and love that the American people have for this president. His popularity is still at an all-time high.
So heads he wins and tails the other guy's lost.
Well, this, as has just been pointed out, is mainly a matter of local issues. There seems to be in this campaign for the first time in the second term of a sitting president of the midterm election an absence of a national negative issue. In 58, we had the economy. 66, we had Vietnam. 74, we had Watergate, the post-Watergate world. 82, we had the economy again. We don't have a negative national issue this time.
A lot of people have said that they think there's already been a Republican realignment in this country, a shift, a basic shift. And yet, from what all we're seeing, if there has been, it's certainly not showing up, or else the Senate election wouldn't be this close.
Well, notice what you just said, Senate. Look at governorships. There, the prediction is anywhere from 7 to maybe as many as 10 more Republican governors elected this year than have been sitting. That will come close to being 50-50. In the House, a recent poll showed that 43% tend to vote Democrat, 42% vote Republican. That has brought the Republican Party up even. That's from, what, a difference of 20 percentage points a decade or so ago. So there has been this fundamental realignment. Whether or not it shows up in the Senate, only Tuesday will tell.
Okay, give us your prediction on the Senate.
I think we'll hold it. It's going to be very close, and it'll go down, in my opinion, into the early morning hours of Wednesday before we know officially from the West Coast who wins.
Well, the president has agreed to go back into Nevada tomorrow for his old friend Paul Laxalt, who's not on the ballot. Santini is your candidate who is, but all the polls seem to suggest that that race is over. Do you disagree?
Race is not over by a long shot. I would put it this way. Santini has been behind. He's come up rapidly over the last 5 days. And this final burst of speed could carry him in, and we hope it will happen that way.
What about California? What are you going to do?
California, at the last poll that came out, is even. We think we're pulling ahead.
May I ask a question that has to do with the White House mechanics? Larry Speaks, it is said, is now negotiating to some extent with your old firm, Merrill Lynch. And Newsweek said at one point that you had greased this negotiation. Is that right?
No, I'm not the midwife, nor the broker, or anything else in that particular setting.
Is he going to leave?
No. Larry has told me that he's quite content with his job. He likes his job. And all Merrill Lynch did was ask me if I would mind if they approached Larry. I said, no, go ahead. He's a free agent.
Well, it doesn't sound like you really want to keep him. If you say to your old firm, sure, go ahead and approach him.
Well, you say that to anybody. Anybody's entitled to a chance to see if he wants to either improve or keep the same job.
Well, is your prediction, Mr. Speaks, will stay in the White House for this full term?
I think, well, now full term is something else again, but I think at the current moment he's going to stay, yes.
Will you?
Pardon?
Will you?
Will I what?
Stay in the White House for the remaining 2 years.
That depends upon whether the president wants me or not.
Well, assuming he wants you. With this talk of the Federal Reserve, is there anything to that?
give that a lot of thought.
Federal Reserve, anything to that?
Nothing to the Federal Reserve. I think that would be, with all due respect to Paul Volcker and my associates who are there on the board, a step backwards for me.
Well, will Mr. Volcker be reappointed, Mr. Reagan?
That's too early to tell.
All right, thanks on that note. Thank you very much, Mr. Reagan. Thanks for coming in today. It's been a pleasure to have you with us. Coming next, our discussion here, mainly about others who are not running for office, but who are going over the polls with magnifying glasses. And joining us will be commentator Jody Powell in a moment. We have had some political figures here today who are disturbed about negative advertising, my opponent is a crook, and so on. Each, of course, claiming the other party was guilty. As far as I have been able to detect, they're both about equally guilty. Why do we have so much of it? Why is it so nasty this year? Jody, you've run a campaign. Did Carter have negative advertising?
Oh, yeah. It got both for and against. And the reason we have more of it now than we had, say, in the early 70s, and I think it really did hit its stride in the late 70s, is frankly because just as in a democracy we get pretty much the sort of government we ask for, we pretty well get the sort of political campaigns we ask for. And the fact of the matter is,
well,
I think
who has asked for these nasty commercials?
It is clear that the American people like it.
Who says
because
it
works? Because it works.
Well, but
if
they're both doing it and one wins.
Well, what happened was that for a few years, people experimented with the idea that, well, the public will react negatively to negative advertising. We'll take the high road here, and we'll let this fellow go on and beat up on us, and there'll be a backlash. Well, the people that made that decision a few years ago are now out of politics doing something else because they got their fannies beat on that
That's exactly
basis.
right. It works. I mean, Jimmy Carter accused his opponent, Carl Sanders, of cufflinks Carl and won the Democratic nomination. Now, that's pretty mild as negative advertising goes, but it works. Now, if the American people don't want negative advertising, then don't vote for the person that really uses it. Let me tell you about the worst ad I've heard lately. Maybe you've got one. In Montgomery County, there's a radio ad, at least there was for several days.
That's right outside Washington.
Yeah, you hear that Montgomery County. You hear the pounding of a judge's gavel, and a voice says, Levitan has broken the law. Levitan is guilty. And you think, my goodness, I mean, are my children safe? What is going on here? Turns out that the accusation is that Levitan has taken too much contribution from someone. But his opponent keeps saying that he's guilty of breaking the law.
As if it were a court
Tame stuff. Tame stuff. Paul West from the Baltimore Sun reports that tonight in California, the top-rated California station is going to give a kind of negative Academy Award, an award to the most negative broadcast commercial they've seen. And it features a teenager smoking marijuana, a convict being freed from prison, and I'm quoting here, scantily clad prostitutes soliciting business. Each of them offers an endorsement of this particular candidate, whose name will not be broadcast on the Brinkley Show, and they says, "Thank you, Senator X." It's a state Senate candidate, as though he's the friend of those who want prostitutes, criminals released, and marijuana users. Now, clearly, there has to be a limit, and that's beyond the limit. It's perfectly fair to note a guy's vote that was wrong, but what's tiresome is when they say, my opponent voted for less than maximum sanctions on apartheid, therefore he hates blacks in South Africa. That kind of construction.
Is it fair to, in a sort of veiled way, accuse your opponent of being a closet homosexual? That's one of our Senate races. That's the accusation, and one candidate is doing that. She denies it.
That raises an interesting question about what role journalism plays in the whole business. The more interesting question to me in that particular race is whether or not that issue ought to be brought out and dealt with by journalists, which it has not been. And maybe it should be, maybe it should.
Aren't they afraid of it? Afraid of it?
I think so. I really think so. And also, I must say, there is something a little bit precious every couple of years about newspapers and television rearing back and getting very sanctimonious about negative campaigning. You know, first of all, most candidates get much nastier things said about them by people like us than they ever do by our opponents. And secondly, as we said before, what the politicians are doing is giving...
Jody. Now, come on.
Well, now I can remember some columns I've written. I can remember some that George has written. I remember some things that Sam has said that had a bit of a slice. I don't think I've ever accused anybody of being the best friend of a prostitute, but sure.
Congressman Edgar, who's running against Arlen Specter for the Senate seat in Pennsylvania, has been criticized for some of his negative campaigns, and he's told me, he said, look, always been negative campaigning. What's different this year is there's so much money that you broadcast your negative thoughts. It used to be you'd go to a union hall or to a teacher's convention, you'd say all these beastly things about your opponent. Now you do it on television. And it just sounds noisier.
Isn't it also true that they can't think of anything else to do in view of the fact that the only two issues the public really is concerned about, drugs and the deficit? Number one, drugs, they can't do anything about it. And number two, the deficit, they won't. So what are you going to...
That's true, and both parties are sort of talking past one another here, that there has been a conscious decision not to join the debate. The president wants to campaign on Star Wars and a national security and national defense. The Democrats, looking for the relative advantage, want to campaign on the economy in states that are down, and so that there is a disinclination.
Even if there were an issue, I want to come back to the point we made earlier, which is it works, David. Now, we were talking before we went on the air about a great negative ad from 2 or 3 years ago, that Roger Ailes did for a Republican who is now in the United States Senate, but who started out 40 points behind. Roger had a bunch of bulldogs looking for his opponent, Walter D. Huddleston, who was then in the Senate. Have you seen Walter D.? Have you seen Senator Huddleston, who had missed some votes and had gone on some junkets? And Roger found that by watching a dog Alpo commercial once on television. He said, that'll fit.
There's one new thing this year, or somewhat new. Maybe this will take care of it. We are beginning to see responses to negative campaigns in the sense we have a sort of an anti-ad in which one candidate will run a negative ad, and the other candidate will then come back taking off on the negative ad and trying to turn the momentum and go after others, and some of them have worked.
When one ad runs, the other candidate runs an ad saying that ad was a lie, and then this one responds that this one was a lie. Doesn't the public get lost? Lying about lying is a very complex trap.
Final move is some guy says all that, and then he says, I am not going to use any more negative advertising, unlike my corrupt and sleazy opponent.
Well, the best anecdote I ever saw on television was the one that Bob Dole used many years ago. He said his opponent accused him of a lot of things which were mudslinging, and they removed the mud one by one on the screen.
Once, David, there was a candidate who got up and he says, my opponent, I'm not going to be negative, my opponent reminds me of Abraham Lincoln. If you can imagine a short, fat, and corrupt Abraham Lincoln.
Well, all right. Thank you all. We'll be back with a few words about these 30-second political commercials we've been looking at in a moment. Finally, next week, the political commercials will disappear from the television screen. And this year, we have seen more 30-second political ads than ever before, and our thinkers and philosophers have complained. 30 seconds are not enough time, they say, for any serious discussion of the great issues of our time. Well, certainly true. But we have seen no politicians who wanted to discuss the great issues of our time. Instead, they have only wanted to attack their opponents with nasty charges, true or false. So I would like to suggest that this year's 30-second commercials have not been too short. They have been too long. If you only want to say, my opponent is a liar, that takes 1.5 seconds. He voted against Social Security. That's 2 seconds. My opponent is a drunk. 1 second. He is behind in his alimony and child support payments. 3 seconds. So all those commercials were simply too long. For this kind of stuff, they don't need 30 seconds. Finally, before we go, to repeat, one of the hostages held in Lebanon has been released. It is confirmed by the White House, and they say they are negotiating, carefully using that word, to get the others out. For all of us at ABC's This Week, until next Sunday, thank you.
This Week with David Brinkley, brought to you by ADM. We bring home America's harvest. And by General Electric. At GE, we bring good things to life. If you wish a printed transcript of this or any other This Week with David Brinkley broadcast, please send $3 to This Week with David Brinkley, 2 John Street, New York, 10038. This Week with David Brinkley is a presentation of ABC News.